What if a single mechanical weakness decided who lived and who fell burning from the sky? In the opening months of World War I, air combat was not heroic or elegant. It was chaotic, experimental, and brutally unforgiving. Pilots climbed into fragile machines made of wood, wire, and fabric, knowing that one design flaw could mean instant death. And for one particular aircraft, that flaw was so severe that most military planners quietly accepted it as a dead end, a plane destined to be outclassed, hunted, and destroyed the moment it met a real enemy in the air. This aircraft was not slow. It was not poorly built. In fact, it flew smoothly, climbed well, and handled better than many of its contemporaries. Yet, despite all of that, it carried a crippling weakness that made it nearly useless in a fight. Its engine sat directly in front of the pilot with a spinning propeller dominating the forward arc. That propeller created an invisible wall between the pilot and his enemy. Any attempt to fire a machine gun straight ahead risked shredding the propeller blades, detonating the aircraft mid. The result was a paradox that defined early aerial warfare. Pilots could see their enemies. They could chase them, but they could not reliably shoot them. Early solutions were awkward and dangerous. Some aircraft mounted machine guns above the wing, forcing pilots to stand up in their cockpits at altitude to reload drums while under fire. Others mounted guns at strange angles, requiring pilots to aim the entire aircraft sideways just to hit a target. These workarounds were slow, inaccurate, and deadly. Enemy pilots quickly learned that if they attacked head-on, most aircraft were effectively toothless. The skies became a hunting ground where positioning mattered more than courage, and where a technically inferior plane could still dominate simply because it could chew where it looked. This specific aircraft suffered more than most. Its design placed the propeller directly in line with the pilot's vision, making forward fire impossible without catastrophic consequences. Commanders knew it. Enemy pilots knew it, and the men forced to fly it felt the knowledge every time they took off. They were faster than some opponents, more agile than others, yet trapped inside a machine that could not fully fight back. In dogfights, they were reduced to evasive maneuvers, hoping to escape rather than engage. Survival depended on avoiding combat, not winging it. Losses mounted quickly. Patrols returned with bullet holes and empty gun magazines. Others did not return at all. Reports from the front were blunt. The aircraft was being outmatched, not because of pilot skill, but because of a design limitation no one seemed able to overcome. Engineers back home debated solutions. Military committees argued over safety, reliability, and doctrine. But war did not wait for paperwork. Every day without a fix meant more pilots dying in machines that were never meant to be helpless. And yet, buried inside this apparent failure was a hidden opportunity. The weakness was clear. The danger was obvious. And under the relentless pressure of combat, someone would soon decide that following the rules was no longer an option. What came next would not begin in a factory or a laboratory, but in desperation, risk, and a willingness to gamble everything on an idea that should never have worked. If this story of ingenuity under pressure has you on the edge of your seat, don't just watch engage. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think could have happened if the hack had failed. Your thoughts matter, and discussing them keeps these incredible historical moments alive. Hit the like button to show your support, because every like helps more people discover stories of daring innovation that changed the course of war. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel to make sure you never miss a story like this. Every subscriber helps preserve history and honors the bravery of those who risked everything by commenting, liking, and subscribing. You become part of a community dedicated to uncovering the forgotten moments that defined battles and shaped the skies. By the time this aircraft entered service, the skies over Europe had already become one of the most dangerous environments any soldier could face. World War I air combat was nothing like the structured dogfights people imagine today. There were no established rules, no proven tactics, no reliable training manuals. Every pilot was learning in real time, often during his very first combat encounter, with mistakes paid for instantly in blood and fire. Aircraft were primitive machines pushed far beyond what their designers originally intended. Most were built from wood frames, fabric skins, steel cables, and engines that overheated constantly. Instruments were minimal. Radios were rare. Pilots navigated by landmarks and instinct, flying in freezing temperatures with open-coke peaches oil spraying into their faces and enemy bullets tearing through fabric wings. Survival depended on awareness, nerve, and improvisation more than doctrine. In this environment, the advantage did not always belong to the fastest or most maneuverable aircraft. It belonged to the one that could deliver effective fire first. Early air combat was brutal because it was asymmetrical. Some pilots could aim their guns directly along their line of sight. Others could not. That single difference created predators and prey in the sky. A plane that could fire straight ahead could dictate the fight. A plane that could not was forced to react, evade, and flee. Enemy pilots quickly adapted. They studied silhouettes, learned which aircraft were dangerous head-on and which were not. They knew exactly when to attack and from which angle. For pilots flying aircraft with severe firing limitations, every encounter felt like being hunted. They knew the enemy could approach aggressively, while they themselves were restricted, forced into awkward firing positions or risky maneuvers that exposed them even further. The psychological pressure was immense. Imagine climbing into an aircraft, knowing that if an enemy appeared directly in front of you, your most natural firing solution could kill you instead. That hesitation, even if it lasted only a fraction of a second, was enough to lose a fight. In the skies of World War I, hesitation was fatal. Pilots who survived quickly learned that boldness mattered more than caution, but boldness without the right equipment often led straight to disaster. Commanders on the ground struggled to keep pace with this new dimension of warfare. Traditional cavalry officers were suddenly responsible for machines that fought in 3 dimensions. Reports from the front were confusing and contradictory. One squadron would praise an aircraft's handling, another would condemn it as a death trap. The difference was often not the aircraft itself, but how it interacted with the harsh reality of aerial combat. Losses were staggering. In some units, average pilot life expectancy was measured in weeks, sometimes days. Training pipelines could not keep up. New pilots were rushed to the front with barely enough hours to fly safely, let alone fight effectively. When they encountered enemy aircraft that could shoot cleanly and decisively, the outcome was often predetermined. And yet, it was precisely this chaos that created opportunity. Because doctrine was still forming and technology was evolving at breakneck speed, there was room for radical change. The rigid separation between engineers, pilots, and mechanics had not yet hardened. Men at the front was still close enough to the machines to understand their weaknesses intimately. They felt every vibration, every delay, every limitation in their own body. In that environment, necessity became the most powerful innovator. When official channels moved too slowly, pilots and ground crews began experimenting on their own. Small adjustments, unofficial modifications, and dangerous ideas spread quietly between airfields. Most failed, some made things worse. But one would soon shatter every assumption about what this weak aircraft could become. And when that happened, the balance of fear in the sky would flip almost overnight. At the heart of this aircraft's problem was a mechanical contradiction that haunted early aviation engineers. The machine needed forward firepower to survive, yet its own design made that nearly impossible. The propeller sat directly in front of the pilot, spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute, occupying the exact line where any effective weapon should fire. To shoot straight ahead meant shooting through the propeller, and in the early days of the war, that was considered suicidal. Pilots and engineers alike understood the physics. A single bullet striking a propeller blade could shatter it, sending splinters through the engine, the cockpit, or both. At best, the aircraft would be crippled. At worst, it would disintegrate. Early attempts to solve the problem were crude and dangerous. Some pilots mounted deflector plates on the propeller blades, hoping bullets would glance off harmlessly. In practice, the deflectors caused vibrations, structural damage, and unpredictable bullet ricochets. Others tried mounting weapons above the wing, forcing pilots to aim indirectly and reload in the middle of combat, often while standing upright in an open cockpit, hundreds or thousands of feet above the ground. None of these solutions addressed the core issue. They treated the symptoms, not the disease. The aircraft was still fighting against its own design. Every workaround added weight, reduced accuracy, or introduced new failure points. Engineers debated endlessly. Could the propeller be repositioned? Could the engine be redesigned? Could weapons be mounted at angles without sacrificing effectiveness? Each idea collided with the same reality. Wartime production was already stretched thin. Radical redesigns meant delays, and delays meant pilots dying in the meantime. What made the situation worse was that this limitation was not theoretical. It was exposed brutally in combat. Enemy aircraft without this problem could simply point their noses at a target and fire. Their pilots did not need to calculate angles or compensate for offset guns. Their instincts aligned perfectly with their weapons. See? The enemy. Aim the aircraft. Pull the trigger. That simplicity was deadly. Pilots flying the flawed aircraft felt constantly constrained. They had to think instead of react. They had to maneuver into awkward positions just to bring their guns to bear. In fast, chaotic dogfights, that extra step was often fatal. Combat reports described the same pattern again and again. Enemy aircraft closing head-on. Friendly pilots breaking away instead of firing. Missed opportunities turning into fatal engagements. Seconds later, ground crews and mechanics were painfully aware of the problem. They listened to pilots describe fights they could not win, shots they could not take, enemies they could not stop. But from their perspective, the aircraft itself worked exactly as designed. The engine ran, the controls responded. The structure held. The flaw was not a malfunction. It was a design choice made before anyone truly understood what air combat would become. Higher command treated the issue as unavoidable. They believed air combat would evolve slowly, that tactics would eventually compensate for technical shortcomings. Pilots were instructed to avoid head-on engagements, to rely on teamwork, altitude, and surprise. On paper, the doctrine made sense. In reality, it assumed perfect conditions that rarely existed in the chaos of battle. As losses continued, frustration grew. Pilots began to lose faith not just in the aircraft, but in the system behind it. They felt trapped between enemy fire and friendly regulations. The machine could be modified. Everyone knew it could, but no one with authority was willing to risk an unapproved solution. Safety committees warned against catastrophic failure. Engineers warned against unintended consequences. Commanders warned against chaos if individual units began improvising. Yet war has a way of stripping away caution. When pilots started dying faster than replacements could arrive, the question changed. It was no longer about whether a solution was officially sanctioned. It was about whether it worked. Somewhere between the hangars and the front lines, between the roar of engines and the silence of empty bunks, the idea took hold that waiting for permission was more dangerous than acting without it. And soon, under pressure that no manual could address, someone would decide to gamble everything on a solution that broke the rules, defied doctrine, and ignored the warnings of experts. The limitation, everyone said, could not be solved, was about to be challenged in the most unforgiving laboratory imaginable, the sky itself. By this stage of the war, desperation was no longer an emotion. It was a condition. Squadrons were bleeding pilots faster than they could be trained, and aircraft losses were being quietly written off as the unavoidable cost of learning air warfare. But for the men living it every day, this explanation rang hollow. They were not losing because they were reckless or unskilled. They were losing because their machines were betraying them at the exact moment survival demanded instant action. Every patrol amplified the pressure. Pilots returned shaken, some silent, others furious, all repeating variations of the same story. They had the enemy in front of them. They had the angle. They had the shot, and they could not take it. The psychological toll was brutal. Knowing you could win, knowing the enemy was vulnerable, yet being forced to break away because pulling the trigger might destroy. Your own aircraft created a unique kind of fear. It wasn't fear of the enemy. It was fear of your own equipment. Commanders began noticing patterns they could not ignore. Certain aircraft types were avoiding engaging altogether. Pilots were flying defensively from the moment they crossed enemy lines. Aggression, the very trait air combat depended on, was being trained out of them by necessity. Survival meant caution. Caution meant missed opportunities. Missed opportunities meant the enemy retained control of the skies. On-the-ground mechanics and engineers felt a different kind of pressure. They watched aircraft take off, knowing their pilots were at a disadvantage before the fight even began. They watched friends disappear into clouds and not return. Every maintenance cycle became an exercise in quiet frustration. The aircraft passed inspections. The engines ran clean. Structurally, everything was sound, yet something was fundamentally wrong, and no checklist could fix it. The official response lagged behind reality. Requests for modifications crawled up bureaucratic chains. Committees debated theoretical risks, while pilots faced very real ones. Proposed changes were rejected as too dangerous, too untested, too unconventional. Safety officers feared catastrophic failures. Engineers feared liability. Commanders feared chaos if frontline units began altering aircraft independently. But the frontline did not care about liability. It cared about survival. In squadrons, pilots began bending the rules in small ways. Mounts were adjusted. Guns were repositioned by inches. Sight lines were altered. Most of these changes helped marginally, if at all. Some made things worse, but they represented a shift in mindset. The idea that doctrine was sacred was eroding. Experience was becoming the new authority. Losses continued to mount, and with them, anger. Pilots began openly questioning orders that told them to avoid certain engagements. If we don't fight, they argued, we die anyway. That sentiment spread quickly. War strips away politeness. It rewards results, and results were no longer coming from obedience alone. The tipping point came quietly, not in a dramatic meeting or official order, but in the aftermath of yet another fatal mission. Another aircraft failed to return. Another bunk remained empty. Another pilot's personal effects were packed and shipped home. Somewhere in that routine tragedy, someone made a decision that would change everything. The decision was not framed as innovation. It was framed as necessity. The men involved did not believe they were making history. They believed they were buying time. One more mission survived. One more patrol returned intact. One more chance to fight on equal terms. What made the situation truly volatile was that everyone involved understood the risk. An improvised solution could fail catastrophically. A single miscalculation could send an aircraft exploding into the ground. Bah, that risk was already present every time a pilot lifted off. The difference was who controlled it. By this stage, fear had changed sides. The fear of breaking regulations began to pale next to the fear of doing nothing. And when that shift happens in war, it opens the door to ideas that would never survive peacetime scrutiny. Somewhere between the roar of engines and the quiet resolve of men who refused to keep losing, the impossible became negotiable. The aircraft that had been dismissed as flawed beyond redemption was about to be altered, not by engineers in factories, but by individuals willing to gamble their lives on a solution that had never been tested, approved, or officially acknowledged. And when that gamble paid off, it would not just save pilots. It would turn a weakness into terror. The idea did not arrive during a briefing or inside an engineering office. It surfaced in the most dangerous place imaginable, between missions, while men counted who had not come back. There was no dramatic announcement, no declaration of rebellion against doctrine. It began as a quiet realization shared among pilots and mechanics who were running out of patience and time. Someone noticed a pattern that others had missed. Every failed engagement followed the same sequence. Enemy aircraft approached head-on. Friendly pilots hesitated, not because of fear, but because of physics. The propeller stood in the way like a loaded gun pointed inward. The aircraft could maneuver, could chase, could climb, but it could not do the one thing air combat demanded instinctively: fire straight ahead. The critical insight was brutally simple. The problem was not accuracy. It was timing. Pilots did not need sustained fire through the propeller arc. They needed brief, precise bursts, a fraction of a second, just enough to strike before the enemy reacted. That realization cracked the door open to something previously considered unthinkable. The conversation likely started as speculation. What if the bullets could pass through the propeller without destroying it? What if the risk was manageable rather than fatal? What if the danger had been exaggerated by theory rather than tested in reality? These were not comfortable questions. Asking them meant acknowledging that accepted wisdom might be wrong, and that men had died following rules that did not deserve obedience. The improvised solution emerged not as a fully formed plan, but as a gamble shaped by urgency. Instead of redesigning the aircraft, instead of moving the gun, someone proposed controlling the bullets themselves. If a bullet struck a propeller blade, the outcome was unpredictable. But what if that strike could be anticipated, managed, or even exploited? The so-called hack was born from this dangerous line of thinking. A mechanical workaround, simple in concept, terrifying in execution. It required modifying existing components using whatever materials were available on the airfield. no blueprints, no official testing, just intuition, observation, and a willingness to accept consequences. To outsiders, the idea sounded insane. Deliberately allowing bullets to pass through the propeller arc defied everything pilots had been taught. Manuals explicitly warned against it. Engineers had dismissed it as reckless, but those manuals were written by men who were not flying daily missions into hostile skies. They were written far from the front, insulated from the reality that caution without effectiveness was a slow form of suicide. The men involved understood the stakes immediately. If the modification failed, the aircraft could be torn apart. The pilot would have no chance. If it succeeded, it would grant something priceless: initiative, the ability to attack instead of evade, to dictate the engagement instead of reacting to it. There was no ceremony when the first modification was made. It was done quietly, probably at night or between sorties, away from officers, who would shut it down instantly. Tools were basic. Adjustments were crude. Every step carried risk, but each step was guided by a singular goal: survive the next encounter. What makes this moment extraordinary is not just the technical audacity, but the psychological leap it required. These men were not just changing an aircraft. They were rejecting the assumption that safety came from obedience. They were choosing controlled danger over guaranteed disadvantage. The first pilot to volunteer did not see himself as a test subject. He saw himself as already condemned by the status quo. Flying without the modification meant accepting inferiority. Flying with it meant at least having a chance. That calculus made the decision easier than history might suggest. And so, without orders, without approval, and without any certainty it would work, the aircraft that had been written off as flawed beyond redemption was rolled out for its next mission, carrying a secret that would either kill its pilot instantly or change air combat forever. The modification itself was almost laughably simple, which made it even more dangerous. No new engine, no reinforced airframe, no advanced mechanism built in a factory. Just a crude, improvised adjustment made with the materials already on hand, guided by intuition and desperation rather than formal engineering theory. That simplicity is what allowed it to exist at all. Anything more complex would have required approval. This did not. The core of the hack was control, not avoidance. Instead of trying to move the gun away from the propeller or protect the propeller from bullets entirely, the solution accepted the collision as inevitable and focused on managing its consequences. The modification altered how and when bullets could pass through the spinning arc, reducing the risk from catastrophic destruction to calculated damage. It was not safe. It was survivable. What made this adaptation revolutionary was that it transformed a forbidden action into a tactical advantage. For the first time, the pilot could aim the aircraft directly at the enemy and fire instinctively. No offsets, no awkward angles, no hesitation. The gun, the eyes, and the aircraft were finally aligned as a single weapon system. That alignment changed everything about how the plane could fight. Mechanics involved understood the risk immediately. Every round fired carried a chance of striking the propeller. Every strike carried unknown consequences. Baci, Carifu. Observation had revealed something critical. Not all impacts were equal. At certain angles and speeds, a bullet could glance, deform, or shatter without instantly destroying the blade. Damage was possible. Failure was not guaranteed. And in combat, probability mattered more than certainty. The modification demanded discipline from the pilot. This was not a spray and pray solution. Bursts had to be short. Timing had to be precise. The aircraft had to be flown aggressively, but intelligently. Used recklessly, the hack would kill its user. Used correctly, it turned the aircraft into something no enemy pilot expected. That surprise was its greatest weapon. Enemy pilots were trained to recognize silhouettes and predict behavior. They knew which aircraft could fire head-on and which could not. They approached accordingly. The moment this aircraft opened fire straight ahead, that mental model shattered. Engagements that had always favored the enemy suddenly collapse into confusion. Pilots who expected a passive target found themselves under direct, accurate fire. Equally important was the psychological shift inside the cockpit. The pilot was no longer flying defensively by default. He was hunting. That change in mindset altered how fights unfolded. Aggression returned. Confidence followed. The aircraft stopped behaving like prey and began acting like a predator. Word spread quickly, but quietly. Pilots talked. Mechanics observed damage patterns. Each mission refined the technique. Adjustments were made. Blades were reinforced. Firing discipline improved. What began as a reckless gamble evolved into an informal system of best practices shared between men who trusted results more than regulations. Commanders were slow to notice at first. Reports mentioned increased victories, enemy aircraft disengaging more often, patrols returning intact. No official explanation accompanied these changes. On paper, nothing had been altered. In reality, everything had. This adaptation did not just improve performance. It redefined the aircraft's role. What had been considered a weakness became its defining strength. The ability to fire directly forward made it lethal in ways its opponents were unprepared for. Engagements ended faster. Enemy pilots hesitated. That hesitation was fatal, and all of it came from a decision to stop avoiding the problem and instead confront it head-on, literally and mechanically. The sky had become the testing ground for an idea no committee would have approved, but that combat immediately validated. The true test did not happen in a controlled trial or a cautious patrol. It happened the only way it could have happened, in sudden violence, at altitude, with no chance to abort. When the aircraft lifted off carrying the improvised modification, everyone involved understood that theory was now irrelevant. Only combat would decide whether the idea was genius or suicide. The pilot climbed into hostile skies, carrying a secret the enemy did not know existed. From the outside, the aircraft looked the same. Same silhouette, same engine note, same vulnerabilities the enemy had already learned to exploit. That familiarity worked against them. Enemy pilots approached with confidence, executing tactics that had worked dozens of times before. Head-on approaches, aggressive positioning, no hesitation. The moment of contact came fast. A closing enemy aircraft appeared directly ahead. Exactly the situation that had once forced pilots to break away. Instinct would have demanded evasion. Muscle memory would have pulled the stick aside. Instead, the pilot did the unthinkable. He held the nose steady and fired. For a split second, everything hung in the balance. The bullets passed through the propeller arc. The aircraft shuddered. There was noise, vibration, a sensation that something had gone terribly wrong. And then the enemy aircraft erupted. Not damaged, destroyed. The engagement ended before the enemy pilot had time to react. What followed was confusion on both sides. The pilot expected failure and got victory. The enemy expected a helpless target and found himself under direct fire. That shock echoed through the sky. The fight did not unfold as planned. The enemy formation broke instinctively, abandoning textbook maneuvers because the assumptions behind them no longer applied. In the minutes that followed, the pilot pressed the advantage. Short bursts, controlled timing. The aircraft held together. The propeller took damage, but not catastrophic damage. The machine flew. The engine kept running. The impossible had just happened in full view of the enemy. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Enemy pilots began to hesitate during approaches. Some broke off early. Others misjudged distances, expecting fire from angles that no longer mattered. That hesitation was deadly. Air combat at this level moved in seconds. A single moment of uncertainty meant losing initiative, position, and often life. When the aircraft returned to base, the damage told the story. The propeller was scarred. Blades showed impacts. But the plane had survived. More importantly, the pilot had survived. And he had not survived by luck. He had dominated an engagement that previously would have ended in retreat or death. Word spread faster than any official report. Pilots crowded around the aircraft. Mechanics examined the propeller. Everyone wanted to understand what they were seeing. The tone was not celebration. It was disbelief. The rules of engagement they had accepted as immutable had just been broken. From that moment on, nothing was theoretical. The modification worked. Not perfectly, not safely, but decisively. It turned a known weakness into an unexpected weapon. The aircraft no longer needed to avoid head-on encounters. It could invite them. Enemy pilots would need time to adapt if they could at all. But adaptation requires understanding, and for now, they had none. All they knew was that an aircraft they thought they understood had suddenly become lethal in ways that defied their training. This single engagement marked the point of no return. The aircraft was no longer a liability. It was something far more dangerous. It was unpredictable, and unpredictability in war creates fear faster than firepower ever could. The destruction of one aircraft was not what truly changed the war in the sky. Pilots had been shooting each other down since the first weeks of aerial combat. What mattered was what the enemy felt afterward. Fear in air warfare spreads faster than facts, and once doubt enters a pilot's mind, it alters every decision he makes at altitude. Enemy pilots began encountering something that should not have existed. An aircraft they had classified as inferior, predictable, and limited was suddenly behaving like a predator. The old mental shortcuts no longer worked. Approaches that had once been routine now felt dangerous. Head-on attacks. Previously, the safest way to engage this aircraft became a gamble with unknown odds. That uncertainty was lethal. Air combat in World War I depended heavily on pattern recognition. Pilots learned silhouettes, performance limits, firing arcs. They did not analyze each encounter from scratch. They relied on instinct built from repetition. The improvised modifications shattered those instincts. Enemy pilots could no longer trust their own experience, and when experience fails, hesitation replaces confidence. Reports from the front began to change in tone. Instead of clear descriptions of enemy behavior, there were questions, confusion. Pilots described being fired upon in situations where they believed themselves safe. Some wrote that the aircraft seemed reckless or suicidal because it flew straight into engagements that logic said it should avoid. Others believed it was a trap, assuming unseen escort aircraft must be nearby. This fear altered formation behavior. Enemy units began spacing out more, breaking tight approaches that had once overwhelmed defenders. That spacing reduced their own firepower and coordination. Attacks became fragmented. Timing broke down. Pilots second-guessed one another. The cohesion that made them deadly began to erode. Even when no shots were fired, the presence of this aircraft influenced engagements. Enemy pilots broke off earlier. They climbed away instead of committing. They abandoned advantageous positions simply because they could no longer predict the outcome. In aerial combat, forcing the enemy to disengage is often as valuable as destroying him. It grants control of the airspace without firing around. The fear was not irrational. It was adaptive. Enemy pilots understood that something fundamental had changed, but they did not know what. Without understanding the cause, they could not develop a counter. They were reacting blind, and blind reactions in three-dimensional combat are slow and clumsy. This psychological shift created a cascade effect. Less aggressive pilots meant fewer successful interceptions. Fewer interceptions meant friendly aircraft survived longer. Survivors gained experience. Experienced pilots fight better. Over time, the balance in the sky tilted not because of numbers or speed, but because confidence had quietly changed sides. What made this especially powerful was that the innovation remained unofficial. There was no announcement, no visible redesign. The enemy could not point to a new model or weapon. The aircraft looked the same. That invisibility fed paranoia. If this plane could suddenly do the impossible, what else might be hidden? Fear does not need full information to spread. It only needs inconsistency. And now, nothing about this aircraft was consistent with enemy expectations. At first, higher command did not understand what it was seeing. Reports arriving from the front were inconsistent, even contradictory. Some units were suddenly reporting improved survival rates. Others noted enemy disengagements that made no tactical sense. A few pilots described head-on victories that, according to existing doctrine, should have been impossible. On paper, nothing had changed. Aircraft models were the same. Armament was unchanged. Official procedures were untouched. That contradiction made commanders uneasy. Military institutions are built to value control, predictability, and standardization. An undocumented advantage is not comforting. It suggests initiative beyond authorization. An initiative without permission threatens hierarchy. So the initial reaction was not celebration, but suspicion. Were pilots exaggerating? Were mechanics improvising dangerously? Was this luck masquerading as progress? Quiet inquiries followed. Ground crews were questioned informally. Pilots were asked to explain how certain engagements unfolded. Most answers were vague by necessity. No one wanted to be responsible for admitting that an aircraft had been deliberately modified outside approved channels. The risk was not theoretical. Court-martial was a real possibility, but results are difficult to ignore in war. As weeks passed, a pattern emerged. Units associated with these unusual victories were suffering fewer losses. Enemy behavior in their sectors was changing. Patrols encountered less resistance. Escorts reported fewer aggressive interceptions. The evidence did not point to coincidence. Something was working. What made the situation delicate was that the innovation had no official name, no standardized method, no single inventor. It spread the way battlefield knowledge often does, quietly and horizontally. A pilot shared an observation with another pilot. A mechanic showed a small adjustment to a trusted colleague. No memos, no manuals, just survival-driven imitation. Commanders faced a dilemma. Shutting it down would mean returning to higher losses. Endorsing it openly would mean admitting that frontline personnel had outpaced doctrine and engineering oversight. In the middle of an active war, neither option was comfortable. So they chose a third path. They looked the other way. Inspections became less aggressive. Questions became less specific. As long as aircraft returned and pilots lived, the exact reasons mattered less. The hack remained unofficial, but it spread faster with every successful engagement. What had started as a desperate gamble became an unspoken advantage. Eventually, higher authorities could no longer pretend ignorance. Performance disparities were too large. Enemy losses too consistent. At that point, formal engineering reviews began, not at the front, but behind it. Engineers studied combat reports. They examined damaged propellers. They tried to reverse engineer what pilots were clearly exploiting in practice. By the time official acknowledgement came, the battlefield had already validated the idea. The innovation had done its work. It had reshaped tactics before policy could catch up. This was not how military doctrine was supposed to evolve. But war does not reward patience. It rewards effectiveness. And effectiveness had already chosen a side. Long after the gunfire faded and the war moved on to new fronts, the true impact of that improvised hack continued to ripple through military aviation. What began as an act of desperation at the front lines quietly rewrote the rules of aerial warfare, not through official declarations, but through undeniable results. The aircraft that had once been dismissed as flawed became proof of a dangerous truth. Innovation in war does not wait for permission. Engineers eventually formalized what pilots had already proven with their lives. The idea that a fighter must fire directly along its line of sight became non-negotiable. Future aircraft designs no longer treated forward fire as a luxury or a secondary feature. It became the foundation of air combat doctrine. The alignment of pilot vision, weapon, and aircraft was no longer optional. It was essential. The lesson reached far beyond a single plane or a single war. It exposed a recurring pattern in military history. Committees optimized for safety and predictability. Battlefields reward speed, audacity, and adaptation. The gap between those two worlds is often closed not by rank or authority, but by individuals willing to gamble when the cost of inaction becomes unbearable. This moment also redefined how militaries viewed frontline knowledge. Pilots and mechanics were no longer just operators of technology, they were contributors to its their observations, their improvisations, and even their violations of protocol began influencing future development cycles. The rigid wall between design and use had been permanently cracked. Perhaps, most importantly, the hack changed the psychology of air combat forever. From that point forward, superiority in the sky was no longer only about faster engines or stronger air. It was about initiative, about who dictated the engagement, about who forced the other side to react. That mental shift can be traced directly to the moment a pilot refused to break away and instead chose to fire straight ahead. Modern air forces would later build entire doctrines around this principle. Fire control systems, synchronized weapons, integrated avionics, and pilot-centered design all carry the fingerprint of that early, dangerous experiment. What seems obvious today was once considered madness, and yet history rarely remembers how fragile that turning point truly was. The hack was not inevitable. It could have failed. It could have killed its first user. If it had, the aircraft might have remained a footnote, and their combat might have evolved more slowly at a far higher human cost. Instead, one decision under pressure altered the balance of fear in the sky, and proved that sometimes the most important innovations are born not from planning, but from refusal. Refusal to accept defeat. Refusal to wait. Refusal to keep flying a machine that could not fight back. That legacy still flies above us today, embedded in every modern fighter that points its nose at a target and fires without hesitation. If you made it all the way to the end of this story, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is made for. Stories like this survive only because people choose to understand them, not just watch them. So take a moment right now and subscribe to the channel, because every new video dives into moments where war, innovation, and human decision collide in unexpected ways. If this story changed how you see military history, leave a like. It tells the algorithm that these hidden moments matter and helps this video reach others who care about real history, not simplified myths. Now I want you to leave a comment. Write one word that stayed with you after this story. It can be innovation, risk, improvisation, or courage. I read those comments, and they shape what stories come next. And before you go, watch the next video appearing on your screen right now. It reveals another moment where a single unexpected decision changed the outcome of a war when no one thought it was possible. You are not just watching history. You are helping keep it alive.